You've probably heard of the PE ratio, a high PE ratio meaning a stock is expensive and a low PE ratio meaning a stock is cheap. But here's the thing, in 2015, Amazon was trading at a PE of 150. Many people found that ridiculous. However, if you invested at that time, then that proved to be one of the best investments of the decade. In this video, I'll show you the metric that I use to predict future growth. And if you understand it, you'll stop chasing hype and start making better choices. Welcome to the channel, friends. I'm Adil, and this is my third cycle in investing. And I can tell you, I've seen portfolios being destroyed, including mine, by hype. And the most common reason behind that is by not knowing how to do your own research. Before I go straight into the video, if you want to stay updated on the markets, including the S&P 500, Bitcoin, gold, and things that I'm watching, then sign up to my free weekly newsletter by clicking the link below. This video is going to be longer than some of my other videos, so I really recommend getting a paper and pen and following along with me to make the most of it. So when we talk about the PE ratio, all that essentially means is the price of the stock divided by the earnings per share. So for example, if the price of a stock is $100, and for every share that you own, if the company makes $5 per share, then you're talking a PE ratio of 20. That's your PE ratio in this example. And just to phrase it a bit differently, what that essentially means, if a company was to grow at the exact same rate that it's growing, then it would take you 20 years to get the money back for your investment. And although the PE ratio is very easy to find, like even if you just Google search any stock of your choice, it'll say the PE ratio. If you're curious in terms of how they work it out, then I'll show you. This is the page for NVIDIA from Finviz. Link in the description below if you want to try this out yourself. You essentially have the price of the stock itself at the top over here, which is $176. And over here, you've got something called the earnings per share, and in brackets it says TTM. TTM stands for trailing 12 months, meaning the last 12 months from today. So you could see that NVIDIA, they have an earnings per share in the last 12 months of 3.51. So if you were to work it out, you've got the price of the stock, which is 176, and you divide it by 3.51, and you will get 50. So the PE ratio of NVIDIA is 50, and you can see that written over here. A PE ratio of 50 is generally considered high, and that's why over here on Finviz, it is highlighted red. But what I want to show you in this video is that the PE ratio on its own is not really that useful of an indicator. And the reason I say this is because you've seen with the formula of the PE ratio, it takes into account how much the company earned in the last 12 months. Now, what they've earned in the last 12 months, that's not the same as what they're going to earn in the future. For example, you've got the earnings of a company on the side over here, and you've got time. And this is the current time, which is 2025. And by using the PE ratio, you're looking in this direction. The thing is, earnings going forwards, it can either go up, it can stay flat, or it could go down. There's three avenues it can go down, and all of this would affect the future PE of the stock itself. A stock can have a high PE and still be cheap, and the stock can have a low PE and still be very expensive, depending on what happens going forwards. So we need something that actually looks at what's going to happen going forwards. And that's where this other metric comes into play. And the other metric I'm talking about is something called the PEG ratio. So what exactly is the PEG ratio? The PEG ratio is your PE ratio divided by the earnings rate going forward. So the earnings growth rate. So this looks at the current valuation of the company, i.e. the PE ratio, and it compares it to what's priced in going forwards. So this is a much more reliable method than using the PE itself. And you might be thinking at this point, how do you know what a company is going to be earning going forwards from here? And that's the right thing to think about, because it's almost impossible to think about what a company is going to do in the future. However, there are signs. So if you look on Finviz, if you look on the financials tab, you can actually see what's priced in going forwards. So with the example of NVIDIA, you could see that in 2025, we're expecting an earnings per share growth of 53%, and next year 41%, and 2027 15%, and the next year after that 9%. That's what's priced in for NVIDIA. And you might be thinking, where do these values even come from? And these values, they come from analysts that actually analyze the companies. So you've got analysts looking at it, and if you look at this year, that prediction was made by 56 analysts. Next year's was made by 57, then 29, and 4 analysts all the way in 2028. So to me, I generally like to look at 3 years rather than 5 years forward. However, if you look at the numbers on Finviz, they generally use the 5-year figure. And the reason I don't like looking at the 5-year figures is because it's really hard to predict so far forward in the future. Because even if you look over here for 2028, there's only 4 analysts looking at it. Whereas the years prior to that, you've got at least 20 analysts looking at it. So the likelihood of the analysts getting it right in the shorter term is much higher than 5 years down the line. So that's just one thing to take into account. So in this example of NVIDIA, if we were to work out the PEG, then we would get the PE ratio. So the PE ratio is 50, and you divide it by the earnings growth rate for the next 5 years. I'm using 5 years just in this example because that's what FinViz uses, and you could find this over here, EPS for the next 5 years, and you could see that it's 35%. So 35% is what it looks at, and that gives it a PEG of 1.4, and you can see that over here. So you've got the PEG over here, and it says 1.4 as the PEG, 1.44 if you're being precise. So essentially, a PEG is a ratio. This was actually made by Peter Lynch, and what he says is that a PEG that's less than 1 means that a company is very undervalued, whereas a PEG between 1 and 2 means a company is more on the expensive side, and a PEG over 2 is very, very expensive. So using in this example that although NVIDIA has a PE ratio of 50, when you take into account the growth that's priced in, it's got a PEG of 1.4. So it's not a bargain, it's not less than 1, the PEG. However, it is between 1 and 2, which means that we are talking about going towards being overvalued, but it's definitely not over 2, which would mean that it's very, very expensive. So at this point, I want you to pause the video and try work out the PEG for your favorite company. Is it undervalued or is it overvalued? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the valuation of NVIDIA and Tesla by using FinViz and plotting it on these meters over here just to see where they stand in terms of valuation. And we've seen already that NVIDIA has a PE ratio of over 50. So already it's out of scale on this PE ratio, which goes only up to about 30. However, when we worked out the PEG, we've seen that the PEG was 1.4. So it's on this green side. So what that tells me is that although NVIDIA is expensive from its PE perspective, it's almost fairly valued when you take into account the growth, i.e. the PEG. Now, if we look at Tesla, Tesla has a PE ratio of 246. So this is going to be way off the scales, so way higher than where NVIDIA is, but I don't have any space on this page, so I'll just put it above where NVIDIA is. And if we take into account the PEG, so the growth that's factored in for Tesla, then Tesla has a PEG of 17. And 17, again, is off the charts when it comes to this. So what that tells me is that Tesla is overvalued both in the PE ratio and when you take into account the growth, the PEG as well. So for me, Tesla, from a fundamental perspective, is not something that I'm interested in because it's really, really expensive right now. Whereas NVIDIA, it's something that I am watching because it's got a PEG which is fairly low, but their PE ratio is still quite high. If the PEG does go below something like 1, then definitely I am very interested in NVIDIA. Now, the way I use PEG is very different compared to what other people might use PEG for. And that's the beauty of PEG because you can adjust things based on what your projections are for the stock. So the way I use PEG differently is rather than using the earnings growth going forward, I prefer using the sales growth going forward because from my previous videos, such as the one above over here, you could see that sales generally drive other metrics such as earnings. So I'd much prefer looking directly at the sales rather than anything else. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I prefer looking at just the next 3 years going forwards compared to the next 5 years going forwards. Because what a company is going to do in 5 years is much harder to predict compared to what a company is going to do in the next 3 years. And this is how I do it. So on FinViz, rather than looking at the forecasts going forward in terms of the earnings per share, I look at the same thing, but for the revenues as opposed to the earnings per share. Because again, like I said, sales drive everything else. And you could see that for the next 3 years, NVIDIA is due to grow 33% next year, the year after 16%, and the year after 7%. So it's slightly different numbers compared to the earnings per share, but I prefer using this because it's much more accurate. So using the numbers over here, let's work it out. So I'll call it Adil's PEG because it's not exactly PEG as how FinViz uses it, but it's just my own version of it. You're still using the PE at the top, but here at the bottom, you're using sales growth. And we know that the PE for NVIDIA is 50, but then when we take into account the sales growth, we've got 33 plus 16 plus 7, which is 56% of the next 3 years. But then if we work that out annually, that's about 19% growth per year. And working that out, you've got a PEG of 2.63. So if we use the adjusted method for the PEG ratio, i.e. my method, you could see that NVIDIA at the moment is very expensive, is way above 2. So this just confirms it's not something that I'm looking at right now because of how expensive it is. So now applying everything in practice, I'm going to use 2 examples. So I've got NVIDIA here on the left, and then I've got Broadcom. 2 very popular stocks in the semiconductor sector at the moment. And all of these numbers are from FinViz. So you've got a PE ratio of 50, you've got a PE ratio of 88 for Broadcom. So let's work out which one's more overvalued at the moment. So using just 3-year values as opposed to 5-year values, which is what FinViz uses, the average 3-year growth for earnings per share for NVIDIA is 22%, whereas 24% for Broadcom. And if we look at the revenue growth, so the actual sales, then for NVIDIA is 19% and for Broadcom is 24%. So now let's work out the PEG. So remember the PEG equals PE divided by growth rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 1 PEG for the earnings, so just the earnings per share, and 1 PEG for the revenues, which is the sales itself. And I personally use the revenue one. If you pause the video right now, try work it out for yourself and let's see if you get the same values as me, and let's work it out. All right, so we're back now. I hope you got the same numbers as I did. So for NVIDIA, I got a PEG ratio of 2.3 for the earnings side of things and 2.6 for the revenue side of things. And for Broadcom, I got a PEG ratio of 3.7 for both earnings and revenue. I hope you got the same. If you didn't or you have any questions, then comment below and I'll try and answer the best I can. So from the two, just looking at the PEG ratio, you can see that Broadcom is the more expensive choice at the moment compared to NVIDIA. However, both of them, they're still over a PEG of 2. So they're both on the expensive side anyway. But from the two, if you were to hold a gun to my head and ask me which one is the better investment right now, I'd probably say NVIDIA. Another interesting thing we can do is we can rearrange this PEG formula to work out how much growth a company needs. So rather than PEG equals PE ratio over growth, we can do growth equals PE over PEG. We can rearrange the formula so that we got growth equals PE over PEG, such as over here, and we can actually work out that to get a fair PEG ratio, i.e. a PEG ratio of maximum of 2, for example, what is the growth that's actually required? And if you were to work that out for NVIDIA, then you got a PE ratio of 50.28 and you're aiming for a PEG of 2. So we're talking about a 25% annual increase in revenues just to justify NVIDIA's growth. And at the moment, you could see that the analysts, they're predicting 19%. So NVIDIA has to exceed expectations to justify its current valuation. And you can do the same thing with Broadcom as well. If you were to do the same thing with Broadcom, then you're talking about 44% growth rate. And you can see that right now, the analysts are predicting 24%. So Broadcom is way higher than where it should be trading at. And on that note, let's also include Tesla as well. And if you were to include Tesla in this formula, just to see what growth Tesla would need in order to be a fair valuation, then we're talking about Tesla having a PE currently of 246. And if you divide that by a PEG, we're aiming for a PEG of 2 to justify the valuation, then Tesla would need to grow revenues by 123% every single year just to justify its current valuation. And here's the issue with Tesla, because if you look at the analyst predictions, you're talking about this year making a 30% loss. Next year, we're talking about profits of 44%, then 44%, then 54% the year after. So give or take, the average prediction is about 47% growth over the next few years. And 47% is not even half of what's currently priced in for Tesla at the moment. And that's my issue with Tesla. Now, as with anything, the PEG ratio is not perfect. Especially on its own, it's not a perfect ratio. So I know it's very tempting to go on stock screeners and then just narrowing everything down by PEG, but I don't think it's wise just to do that on its own. And here's the issue with PEG. The growth rates, they estimated by analysts. And analysts, they get things wrong. So they're not always right. Next thing is, it's hard to predict future. It's very difficult to say that, next year we're going to grow 10%, the year after we're going to grow another 10%. Things are very unpredictable. Trump might come out and tweet about some new law or policy or some new taxes or even the tariffs, for example. It's really difficult to plan for these sort of things. So that will affect valuations. But the good thing with PEG is that you can adjust it the way that you feel is right. So for example, if you don't want to look at the next 5-year growth, you only want to look at the next 3 years, you can look at the next 3-year growth. If you think that analysts are wrong in predicting a stock has 10% growth and you think that the stock probably has about 8% growth, it's very customizable to the research that you do for the stock. And the other thing is that it's a good filter. And what I mean by it's a good filter is if you have 10,000 stocks in front of you and you're trying to narrow down to get the list as small as possible, it's a good initial filter because you don't want to be investing in the stocks that have a PEG ratio of over 20, etc. because those are going to be really, really overvalued and it would need a lot of growth. So it's a good filter to start with, along with other things. And if you want to see what the number one thing that I look at when actually looking at a company, then click in this video in the corner over here where I go through that. And if you found this video useful, then drop a comment below and also sign up to my free weekly newsletter.